John Cornyn is currently serving his second term representing the great state of Texas in the U.S. Senate. He was first elected in 2002 and re-elected in 2008. Prior to his election, he served us as a district judge, a member of the Texas Supreme Court, and as Texas Attorney General. Senator Cornyn believes that during these challenging economic times, Congress should be putting policies in place that lower our taxes and provide incentives for Texas businesses to succeed. He also believes that government policy should not be adding unnecessary administrative and regulatory burdens and challenges to the marketplace. He is working to ensure a climate of innovation, job growth, and creation, and has long been a friend to Round Rock and Williamson County. Most recently, which we'll hear about, he's been helping challenge federal agencies to the use of endangered species regulations that delay important transportation projects and further stifle economic development in our region. Senator Cornyn firmly believes that Washington should be taking its cues from our state and not from the other way around. Please join me in welcoming our good friend, Senator John Cornyn.
Well, since Doug and Curtis gave my speech, we'll go right to questions. No, in all seriousness, I appreciate those generous words, Curtis and Doug. You're laying the roadmap ahead of us. Let me start, though, by first congratulating all of those office holders and candidates for public office who had a successful primary night on Tuesday. We've all got our work cut out for us, not the least of which is to survive November, but then obviously do the job that each of us have been elected to do in our respective jurisdictions. I also want to just take a minute to maybe last to introduce my staff. First of all, the only house introduced John Sloan, but he didn't introduce a very important person in my office, and that is his daughter, Carly, who's an intern. So thank you for your service. And of course, Elizabeth Cox and then Sandy Edwards, you know, are both my deputy regional director and my regional director here in the Central Texas region. And then David James is my state director, who's around here somewhere right over here with the camera. And then Jessica Salmon's back there. Wave, Jessica, is my communications Texas Press secretary. So thank you for letting me introduce them. I can't think about Round Rock without thinking about a couple of things. One is, first of all, the booming economy and the rapid growth we see here. Thank goodness people can vote with their feet, and they can move to places where opportunity is provided and in a place where we still believe in the free enterprise system as an engine of economic growth. Yes, you can, if you work hard and make sacrifices, you can reap the rewards of that. It's nothing to be discouraged or punished. It's something we ought to encourage, because in the process it creates jobs and opportunities for other people to work hard and achieve their dreams. So this is undoubtedly one of the very best places in the country and in our state to work and to raise a family. And it has become, Round Rock area has become a prominent symbol of the broader economic boom in our great state. I also am reminded of a young man that many of you know, Alan Babbitt, who I first met at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. Corporal Babbitt enlisted in the U.S. military shortly after 9/11, and he became a medic in the 82nd Airborne. On March the 31st, 2003, his unit was involved in a firefight in a small Iraqi town, and Corporal Babbitt was shot in the stomach. He had to remain on a gun truck in the middle of the battlefield for 3 hours before he could be evacuated. As I said, I had the chance to meet Alan at Walter Reed before he recovered enough to come back home. And of course, his extraordinary family, his mother in particular, is just an unbelievable person, Rosemary. And I understand they couldn't be here today because they had to be someplace else. But I can't help but think, when I think about Round Rock, to think about Alan, his service, his sacrifice, but also what he represents in terms of our country's future. Young men and women willing to pay the price to make those kinds of sacrifices to help preserve our freedom. And so you have a lot to be grateful for. We all have a lot to be grateful for in the Allen Babbitt's that serve us so well. I also, on Memorial Day, last Monday, I was in San Antonio. We have an annual event now where we invite all of the new students who are graduating from high school who are going to the U.S. service academies. That's the, of course, West Point, the Air Force Academy, Naval Academy, Merchant Marines, Coast Guard, and the like. And I have to tell you, at a time when there's a lot of cynicism and maybe even pessimism about the future of our country, you don't get that sense being around these young overachievers. I mean, these are incredible young men and women who at a very young age have decided if they work hard and apply themselves, not only in academics, but athletics, in the arts and the like, that they can achieve their dreams. And thank goodness for all, we should all be very grateful for the fact that they want to serve, first by attending our service academies, and then in our uniformed military, and then, of course, become the leaders, not only for the military, but for our country going forward. So it's been a pretty good week being with those folks, and those young men and women and their proud parents, and thinking about people like Allen. But of course, I want to talk to you about the challenges we face. I am an optimist, which is to say that I am a Texan. We're all optimistic. We don't believe there are any obstacles that we can't overcome, any challenges we can't meet. But I'm also reminded of what Winston Churchill once said. He said, America always does the right thing after it's exhausted every other possibility. And I want to tell you about some of those things that we're working our way through to get to that ultimate success, and some of the things that loom very, very large, some of which Doug and others have already mentioned. First of all, before the end of the year, we need to stop the single largest tax increase in American history. How did we find ourselves with this huge tax increase as a default? In other words, Congress doesn't have to act to pass more taxes. We're going to see a huge tax increase if Congress does not act along with the President. And that's because many of the tax provisions that have been put into place, starting with the so-called Bush tax cuts in 2000, were passed for a 10-year temporary window. Now, I like to call those tax cuts, the so-called Bush tax cuts, the Bush-Obama tax cuts, because in 2010, President Obama signed a law extending those for 2 more years, recognizing that back in 2010, the last thing we wanted to do in a fragile economic recovery is to raise taxes on the people we were depending upon to make those investments and create those jobs. But we know for sure this is one of the most predictable crises you can imagine, sort of a slow-moving train wreck, if you will. But unless we act, family budgets will be squeezed even tighter, disposable income will shrink, and many jobs will be destroyed. It would be a disaster for our economy. It could easily push us back into a recession. Everyone knows that, including the President of the United States. So far, we've been disappointed, and the uncertainty of our federal tax policy has been deeply harmful to our economic recovery. I know this morning we got a very disappointing jobs report, and another indication that economic growth is slowing down even from where we hoped it might be, less than 2%, I think 1.9% of GDP. But I have to ask you, if you're an entrepreneur and we're thinking about starting a new business, or if you're an existing business and thinking about expanding your business, what would your incentive be to start that new business or create new jobs, not knowing what your tax picture is going to look like come January the 1st? I'll say it again, the last thing we should be doing is raising taxes during the weakest economic recovery since World War II. Unfortunately, even if we're successful in avoiding the full tax-mageddon, as it is sometimes called, scenario, the health care law that was passed a few years ago that's now being challenged in the United States Supreme Court contains a new surtax on investment that will take effect in 2013. It's amazing how many provisions of the health care bill did not take effect until after the election. Kind of a funny coincidence that way. This new surtax, of course, will hamper small business investment, which, of course, is the lifeblood of private sector job creation. The good news, and there is some good news, is that there is an emerging consensus on tax reform. The bad news is that the president seems to be distracted by other things rather than focused on addressing this vital activity in terms of growing our economy. The bipartisan consensus for tax reform is pretty straightforward. We should lower rates and we should broaden the base. This would make our tax system not only more logical, but more efficient and more conducive to strong economic growth. It may not be 999, but it's something close to it. And of course, this was a prominent recommendation of the President's own bipartisan debt commission, known as Simpson-Bowles, that reported in December 2010. The case for tax simplification is overwhelming, which is one reason why Herman Cain's proposal resonated with so many people, even though maybe they disagree with some of the details. This year alone, Americans will spend an estimated $350 billion just to comply with the tax code. $350 billion just to comply with the tax code. Small businesses face a paperwork burden that is crushing. These are the folks who, as I said earlier, we rely upon to create about 70% of the new jobs in America. And yet we have a tax system which effectively punishes them and makes it harder for them to generate those jobs. When it comes to the IRS, many small businesses don't enjoy, of course, the same resources, the army of lawyers and accountants who can help deal on a level playing field with the IRS. According to the World Bank, it's now more difficult to pay business taxes in the United States than it is in many Western European countries. When a heavily taxed, heavily bureaucratic country like France makes it easier to pay business taxes in the United States of America, you know something is fundamentally wrong. For that matter, we now have the highest corporate tax rate of any country in the world, now that Japan has reduced their corporate tax rate. And of course, we know our corporate tax rates for companies headquartered here in the United States who have businesses abroad, they are disincentivized to bring that income back because they will be taxed twice. So what they do, our tax code actually incentivizes them to leave the money overseas and hire people overseas and to build their business over there rather than here at home. And that's the opposite of what our tax code ought to do. Now, I almost hesitate to bring up this next topic because I know anytime you mention immigration, it is controversial. And I'm one of those people who believe the first thing we need to do is to create some order out of chaos in our broken immigration system, starting with border security and enforcement. But there's another element of immigration reform that I think is very important because our world-class universities attract foreign nationals from all over the world, and we effectively subsidize their education. And many of them study for the master's degree program or PhD programs in the STEM fields, math, science, and engineering. And then because of our broken immigration policy, we simply send them home and they go create jobs abroad and they compete with us in a global economy. And that doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense to me. So one proposal that I've made is not increasing net immigration at all, but to take 55,000 green cards that currently are awarded on a lottery basis. And I realize we all won the lottery by being born in the United States, right? And loving families that supported us and made our success possible. But it makes no sense to me to have a lottery visa system that just by accident of the lottery, you happen to get a green card to come to the United States. So what we're going to do is take those under this legislation and dedicate those to 55,000 students who have master's degrees or PhDs in STEM fields, math, science, and engineering, and encourage them to stay here and create economic growth in the United States. Before I take your questions, or perhaps dodge a few, I just want to make a comment about regulatory overreach. There's been some allusion to that subject here today. And it's no secret that regulatory overreach has hampered economic growth and it created more economic uncertainty. You know, in 2008, we had a really big election, and it was pretty lopsided. But in 2010, we had another important election, and as Charles Proudhammer, one of my favorite pundits, likes to say, he said the electorate issued a temporary restraining order on the president's legislative agenda. But what the voters could not do in 2010, because it wasn't a presidential election, is change the bureaucrats who head up these various regulatory agencies that are part of the executive branch. And it starts, I would say, with energy production. Texans are proud to be the biggest energy producing state in the country. But we're also frustrated by federal regulations on domestic energy production. Indeed, it's no exaggeration to say that Washington and the regulatory policies coming out of Washington, D.C. are the single biggest obstacle to an American energy renaissance that would create huge amounts of domestic oil and gas resources. For example, if the U.S. oil production was allowed to reach its sustainable potential, our oil import costs would be cut in half, and our GDP would increase by roughly $250 billion. As for natural gas, the gift we've been given of domestic energy supply that we need to continue to develop, we are at the early stages of a shale gas revolution, and production has been surging nationwide. Curtis was telling me earlier it's hard for him sometimes to get the employees he wants, the workers he wants, because so many of them are going down to the Eagle Ford shale where they're making a lot of money in that boom town because of that huge natural gas find. But we are at the early stages of a shale gas revolution, and production has been surging nationwide. It's been often said that America is the Saudi Arabia of natural gas. And the big question is, will federal regulators allow the U.S. natural gas industry to realize its full potential, including its potential for creating jobs and stimulating the economy? The administration has given us some reasons to doubt that. According to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the Environmental Protection Agency alone is moving forward with 31 major economic rules and 172 major policy rules that will affect the energy sector alone. Meanwhile, closer to home, more than 100 different species found in Texas have either received or are threatened to be listed as endangered by the Fish and Wildlife Service. We had a little bit of a success story over in the Permian Basin involving a little 5-inch lizard called the sand dune lizard, where Fish and Wildlife Service threatened to list that as endangered species without doing the due diligence to find out what the facts were and to do the science. And we had a good success story. But I know closer to home here in Round Rock, there are significant concerns over the Fish and Wildlife Service not doing its due diligence, or perhaps in the context of multi-district litigation, some consent decree being entered that would be harmful, certainly to the economy as regards endangered species. With current scientific information analysis, we know that stakeholders can work with local officials and federal officials and adopt reasonable regulations that protect our environment without damaging economic growth. We don't have to pick one or the other. We can have both. But when regulatory agencies discount real-world data or fail to follow due process, as they've done in EPA has done in a number of recent instances, they needlessly destroy jobs and threaten whole industries. That's why I'm drafting legislation that will shield Americans from the burdensome impact of closed-door litigation settlement negotiations between environmental groups and the federal government. And of course, I know many people in this room are worried that the Fish and Wildlife Service will list various salamanders as endangered or threatened species. I talked, of course, with the mayor and with Commissioner Kobe earlier about this very topic over the last few months. And it would undermine billions of dollars of proposed economic development here in Williamson County. And I know that local stakeholders have launched a major conservation effort to protect these little critters, these salamanders, and they're also studying the issue quite intensely. Just yesterday I sent, along with Congressman Carter and Senator Hutchinson, a letter that you should find at your table requesting they postpone their decision on the salamanders until the local studies that are already well underway are completed. It doesn't seem like too much to ask for to know what the facts are before the federal government acts. As you know, this onslaught of potential listing was a result of closed-door settlement between the federal agents, federal government agents and the environmental groups, and it's raised substantial legal concerns. As a recovering judge, I was tell Judge Carter, we're part of the recovering judge caucus in the Congress, but I've seen firsthand how some of these consent decrees and settlements can basically take the decision-making out of the hands of elected officials who are in fact directly accountable to the voter for their decision, and basically put them in the hands of life-tenured judges who are not accountable to the voters, or perhaps in consent decrees that can't be changed without substantial difficulty. So this legislation I'm drafting would address just that problem. Let me just say in conclusion, as the 2012 campaign election season heats up, we need to remember what what this debate should be about, and that's our economic recovery. This is not just about budget arithmetic or GDP ratios. It's about supporting policies that deliver genuine economic fairness and allow Americans to secure their right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's why I'm working to reverse government overreach of the last 3.5 years and revitalize the great American jobs machine. At a moment in history when journalists and some so-called intellectuals are ruminating about American decline, as I told you at the beginning, I remain optimistic that the 21st century will yet be another American century. I'd be glad to answer or dodge a few questions as the time remains. Thank you very much. As I always say, I'll take a question, or if you want me just to stand here and listen while you talk, I'll do that too. If anybody's got something on their mind.
Senator?
Yes, sir.
I just speak here.
I think I can hear you. I think you can hear you.
So the Senate hasn't passed the budget in 1,100 and some days. It's required by law. What is going to trigger some action? What are we going to do to read? What are we going to do to run this country like a business instead of the nonsense that's going on? Everyone's sick of it.
Well, it's a scandal. It's a scandal. The law requires Congress to pass a budget every year. It requires the President to propose a budget, and requires both houses of Congress to come up with a budget, which of course does what you have to do in your business or in your family, which is decide, okay, what are my priorities? What do I have to do? What do I have to spend money on? What are the things I'd like that I can't afford now, so I've got to put it off? And what are the things that are, you're just not going to be able to afford? Well, that kind of rational process is not taking place in Washington these days, because in the Senate, we haven't had a budget for 3 years. It is just outrageous. Senator Reid, who's the majority leader, who has extraordinary power in the Senate because he's the one who controls the agenda and the flow of work across the Senate floor. And it's fair to say that if the majority leader doesn't want it to happen in the Senate, it won't happen because of the extraordinary power the majority leader has. And when asked about it, he's pretty straightforward. He said he doesn't want his incumbent candidates who are up running for re-election to have to face tough votes. Well, excuse me, I thought that's what my job was, and to be held accountable for those votes. And it's just as simply a scandal, as I said earlier. I don't know. In politics and in life, you can try to change people's minds if they will listen to you. But I can tell you in politics, when you can't change their minds, sometimes you need to just change the office holder who's making those decisions. And I think that's where we are.
Senator, thank you for your letter to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. I really appreciate it. But all of us that have been involved in this really think the answer is changing the Endangered Species Act itself. What are your thoughts on that?
Lisa said she thinks the answer really is changing the Endangered Species Act, and that certainly is an avenue that we need to explore. And part of the legislation that I would be offering would change the Endangered Species Act by limiting the authority to enter into the consent decrees, as I discussed earlier, between some of these environmental groups that actually recover attorney's fees from the taxpayer as part of the settlement, but then take the decision-making process out of the hands of local and state officials. I think we need to use every tool in the toolbox, and certainly changing the endangered species is one of them. It is a challenge in the Congress dealing with endangered species because there's some very active so-called environmental groups. But you know what? I consider myself an environmentalist. I care passionately for the health of my family and want to make sure that they have clean air to breathe and clean water to drink. And this idea that some people don't care about the environment and others really care is, to me, a bunch of malarkey. So I think what this is about is operating based on the facts and on good science and making smart decisions. Not so it's a lose-lose proposition, but if possible, it's a win-win proposition. We preserve the species, we keep the environment clean for present and future generations, but we also don't get in the way mindlessly of economic development and job growth. And that's kind of where I think we are now. So that's one of the things we will take on this. Here's your last chance. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you first for your service and representative of Texas. You do a fine job. What is your feeling on when the Supreme Court will make their decision and what will happen in the Congress following that on health care?
Well, it'll be in a month. That's when the Supreme Court takes its annual recess, and they typically clear their docket and hand down decisions before they break for July. So I was there for one of the 3 days of the arguments, and it was an extraordinary experience. When I was Attorney General, I had the great honor of arguing 2 cases in the United States Supreme Court myself, so I'd been in that courtroom before, but never had I seen a case, and I don't think there's been one since the 19th century, when you had such extended arguments over 3 days. And that's, to me, indicative of the seriousness with which the court is approaching this decision. And I thought some of the most interesting questions were for the Solicitor General, the lawyer representing the federal government, and basically defending the case against the unconstitutionality claims. And he was asked straightforward, if the federal government can make you do this, that is, force you to buy a product or penalize you if you don't buy a government-approved product, what can the federal government not do? In other words, is there anything beyond the power of the federal government? And I thought that was a very telling question. And the Solicitor General stumbled around. He couldn't come up with a good principled line that they could defend and say, well, they can do this, but they can't do that. But of course, the 10th Amendment describes very clearly the fundamental structure of our government from the local, state, and the federal level. It says simply that the federal government is one of enumerated powers, delegated by the people in the states to the federal government, but it's limited, and the rest are reserved, the rest of the powers are reserved by the people, we the people, and the states. And so, under the Commerce Clause, which is the provision of the federal Constitution, if they're claiming this unprecedented power, I think the court's going to strike it down and say this is too far. And of course, then the next logical question is what's next? And we've been working very hard to come up with good answers to that question that will hopefully help us hold down health care costs. That's one of the real disappointments, I would say, in that 2,700-page behemoth of legislation is it did absolutely nothing to try to contain health care costs. Indeed, we've seen health care costs continue to rise and get out of the range of affordability of many people. And we need to realign the incentives for both practitioners, providers, and for individuals. And I'll just close on this. One of the most interesting sort of developments I sat down a couple years ago with folks at Whole Foods in Austin, and they have a health savings plan, and I'm told by management that about 80% of the costs are paid either by their insurance, because they have a catastrophic insurance plan together with the health savings account, is paid out of those, and only 20% come out of pocket. And they love it. And people are made better consumers of healthcare, because it's not like you're given a credit card for which you will never see the bill, which is kind of what our current fee-for-service approach is like, and the reason why Medicare is in such dire straits. So we can and must do better, and I know that conversation will occur in earnest when the Supreme Court hands out its decision later next month. Thank you very much.